Chapter 1. The Awakening. MTF Epsilon-6, Field Log, January 23, 2024. Agent Sarah Collins, Lead Operative. Mission Code 11-Revenant. Chapter 3. Location: Woodstock, Vermont. The town of Woodstock had always been picturesque. Quaint colonial architecture, snow-dusted trees, and the kind of small-town silence that city folk dream of. But tonight, silence had a different weight. It was thick, uneasy. It pressed against the chest like a premonition of something watching from the shadows. Agent Sarah Collins adjusted her night vision goggles as she stepped out of the transport vehicle. The rest of Mobile Task Force Epsilon-6, Village Idiots, fanned out behind her, their dark tactical gear blending into the overcast night. The team had been deployed after a series of bizarre civilian reports surrounding SCP-011, the Sentient Civil War statue. The statue, a Union soldier carved in stone, had long been considered stable, a minor anomaly, a curiosity. Until now. "Let's set up," Collins ordered, her voice steady. Her team moved with precision, unpacking monitoring equipment and infrared cameras. As she approached the statue, a single floodlight illuminated its face, cold, emotionless, and yet somehow aware. The reports had started small, locals swearing that SCP-011 had shifted its pose, its rifle held at a different angle. Then came the missing animals, stray dogs and birds vanishing near the site. Most disturbing of all was the whispering. Not the wind, not the trees. Voices. Just on the edge of... Dr. Langston, the team's field researcher, stood beside Collins, reviewing the anomaly's file on his tablet. "Records show SCP-011 has been sentient for over a century, but it was never aggressive, only capable of minor movements, cleaning bird droppings off itself, looking in certain directions. Harmless." "Yeah," Collins muttered, staring at the stone-carved rifle. "Then where's the gun?" Langston blinked and followed her gaze. His breath hitched. SCP-011's hands were empty. 45 hours. Collins crouched by the statue's base, tracing her gloved fingers along the snow-dusted pedestal. The engraving read, "To those who served, never forgotten." But beneath it, something new had appeared, etched deep into the stone as if scraped by a bayonet. The war never ended. A cold weight settled in her gut. "Get me thermal scans," she ordered, "and someone check the town's surveillance feeds. I want to know where that damn rifle went." As her team mobilized, something in the air shifted. The night felt heavier, a faint pressure, like being deep underwater. Then, a gunshot. Loud, close, echoing across the trees. "Contact," a voice shouted over comms. "West perimeter, movement in the woods." Collins bolted toward the sound, her pulse hammering in her ears. She found Agent DeSantos aiming his rifle into the dense tree line. His face was pale. "I saw something. Swear to God it was a man moving through the trees, but I only caught glimpses. Uniform, Civil War era." "Did you fire?" "No, sure, it wasn't me." More silence. The wind whispered through skeletal branches. Then came the footsteps. Soft at first, crunching through snow, getting closer. Collins raised her rifle. "Identify yourself," she commanded. No answer. The floodlights flickered, the radio crackled. Then, from deep within the trees, a voice, gravelly, distant, not human. "They never left the battlefield." And just like that, DeSantis was gone. 10 hours. The team searched for an hour. No tracks, no sign of struggle. One moment DeSantos had been there, then nothing. Collins gritted her teeth, gripping her rifle so tightly her knuckles ached. Her earpiece crackled again. Static. "SSH, Collins?" She froze. The voice was DeSantos. "DeSantos, what's your position?" she demanded. More static. Then, shh, very. Understone, don't forget us. The voice warbled, distorted like an old radio transmission from another time. Then silence. Collins turned back toward the statue. SCP-011 was staring at her. The blank stone eyes, once lifeless, now bore an unmistakable presence, a knowing, a weight of history and something older, deeper. Then it spoke. The war isn't over. Chapter 2. Echoes of the Past. 1. 30 hours. Woodstock, Vermont. The wind had died. No rustling leaves, no distant calls of the nocturnal. Just the stillness of the dead. Agent Sarah Collins stood frozen, her breath curling in the cold night air as SCP-011's voice faded into silence. The war isn't over. Those words gnawed at her rational mind. Statues didn't speak. Not like that. Not with intent. She turned to her remaining team. We regroup at command, now. No one argued. The remaining members of MTF Epsilon-6 moved quickly, scanning their surroundings, weapons raised, eyes darting into the black void beyond their flashlights. Collins stole one last glance at SCP-011. It stood just as it always had. Rifle missing, hands empty, its stone-carved gaze locked onto her as if it had chosen her for something. She didn't want to think about what that meant. 2. 10 hours. Mobile command station. The command tent was tense with controlled panic. DeSantos was still missing. The town's surveillance feeds were coming up corrupted, and the perimeter sensors had picked up phantom signals, heat signatures where nothing should be. "Play it again," Collins ordered. Dr. Langston pulled up the footage from a street camera near the statue. At 0:47 hours, just after the gunshot, the feed glitched. Then came the shadow. The video showed something humanoid moving along the treetops. But it wasn't walking. It flickered, jumping from frame to frame like a badly rendered image struggling to stay anchored to reality. It moved past the statue, and for a fraction of a second, SCP-011's face shifted, its neutral expression twisting in. Then the video cut out. "That's impossible," Langston muttered, rewinding the footage. There was no known anomaly linked to SCP-011 beyond limited sentience. This is new. Collins exhaled through her nose. "And it's getting worse." The comms crackled. "Collins, we've got something, north of the memorial buried under frost." Collins grabbed her rifle. "Let's move." 2:40 hours. The unearthed relic. The team gathered at the dig site, just outside the statue's range. Snow had been cleared away unnaturally fast, as if something had already begun to uncover what lay beneath. The object? A rusted Civil War air. But it wasn't just the gun that made Collins' stomach drop. It was what was wrapped around it. Skeletal fingers gripping the weapon as if it had never been released. "Jesus," Agent Holt muttered, shining his light on the remains. "This is old, maybe from the battle that happened here." Langston knelt beside the bones, examining the decay. "No, this isn't right. These should have decomposed long ago, but there's still connective tissue." Collins felt her pulse in her ears. "What are you saying?" Langston's jaw tightened. "I'm saying these remains are newer than they should be, as if time didn't move the way it should underground." Then the whispering started. At first it was just static, like wind slipping between frozen trees. Then words, hundreds of them, layered over one another. "We held the line. Never surrendered. You buried us. It exploded. We never left." The sound rose, a crescendo of ghostly voices pressing against reality. The ground trembled. Then the skeletal hand twitched. A flash of blue light erupted from the bones, and Collins saw something she couldn't rationalize. A battlefield. Not a memory, not a hallucination, but real. A ripped fragment of time, layered atop the present. She was there. 3-0 hours. The Ghost War. Collins stood knee-deep in blood-soaked mud. Gunfire crackled, cannons roared. The scent of iron and burnt flesh choked the air. She wasn't alone. Union soldiers, their faces twisted in agony, fired their rifles into a fog-drenched enemy line, but their bullets found nothing. Then she saw them, the Confederate regiment, but they weren't men. Their forms shifted between flesh and rot, between bone and smoke, empty eye sockets still locked in a soldier's rage, their muskets raised in silent hatred. They weren't fighting the past. They were fighting now. Collins stumbled back as one of the spectral soldiers turned, staring straight at her. A whisper rode the wind, deep and ancient. "You cannot leave." The soldier charged. Collins screamed. And suddenly, she was back. 2 hours. The present. She hit the ground hard, gasping for air. Holt was shaking her, his eyes wild. "Collins, what the hell just happened?" She scrambled to her feet, her brain struggling to process. The rifle, the whispering, the battlefield. Langston's voice was hoarse. "What did you see?" Collins swallowed, her mouth dry as sand. "They're still fighting." A heavy silence fell over the group. Then a familiar clink rang through the cold night air. They turned. SCP-011 had moved. It had bent down, one stone hand grasping the unearthed rifle. And as its fingers tightened, the wind whispered something new. We marched. Chapter 3. The Forgotten Regiment. 3:30 hours. Mobile Command Station. The makeshift command center was on high alert. The team had seen it move. SCP-011 had bent down, grasped the unearthed rifle, and whispered in a voice older than the grave. The march at dawn. Collins had heard a lot of unsettling things in her years with the Foundation, but this was something different. DeSantos is still missing. We've got civilian reports of apparitions, localized time distortions, and now SCP-011 is changing. She ran a hand through her sweat-damp hair. We're not dealing with a single anomaly. We're dealing with an entire war trying to come back. Langston's expression was grim. A war that never ended. Collins turned to the nearest operative. "Pull every historical record of the Woodstock Volunteers Regiment. I want to know why these soldiers weren't laid to rest." Minutes later, the files came in, and what they uncovered made Collins' blood run cold. 4:0 hours. The Vanished Battalion. The Woodstock Volunteers Regiment was a Union battalion of 237 men assigned to hold a key strategic outpost in the winter of 1862. Owing to military records, the regiment never officially disbanded. There was no record of their deaths, no burials, no confirmed survivors. They were just gone. Newspaper clippings from 1863 told conflicting accounts. Some townsfolk claimed the regiment deserted. Others swore they saw ghostly soldiers patrolling the outskirts of town for weeks after they had supposedly died. One account stood out. An entry from a diary belonging to a local priest. "The war has ended, yet they do not rest. Their forms flicker between worlds, their faces sunken and forgotten. They whisper of battle, of honor left unfulfilled. I fear the earth itself will not take them." Collins clenched her jaw. "They never left." Langston exhaled sharply. SCP-011 is more than just sentient. It's an anchor for these lost soldiers. If it's waking up, then so are they. Then the alarms blared. A perimeter breach. Something was coming. 4:30 hours. The ghost soldiers arrived. The security monitors flickered, distorting as the feeds cut in and out. Shadows moved between the trees. Collins and her team rushed outside, rifles raised. Then the gunshots started. Not theirs. From nowhere. A muzzle flash lit up the darkness, followed by the distant boom of cannons. Then they saw them. The Woodstock Volunteers Regiment. 200 phantasmal soldiers, their figures shifting between bone and flesh, between past and present. Some carried muskets that shouldn't exist. Others bore swords rusted with time, their uniforms half decayed, half restored. And at their head, one figure stood taller than the rest. SCP-011. No longer a statue, but a man of stone and war. It clutched its rifle, turning its soulless gaze toward Collins. "We are ready to march." 45 hours. The reality war. Collins barely had time to process before the world shifted. The ground trembled. Time warped. The command center flickered. Modern structures dissolving into wooden barracks. The town's skyline twisted, roads vanishing, buildings reverting to their 1,862 forms. They were being dragged back. No. History was trying to overrate the present. Collins gritted her teeth. "We need to break the loop." Langston was already scanning the area. "It's SCP-011. It's the keystone. It's not just waking up. It's trying to bring them all back." A rifle cracked, and an invisible bullet ripped past Collins' head, shattering a piece of the transport truck behind her. This wasn't just an illusion. This was war. 50 hours. The choice. Collins had one shot. The past was colliding with the present. If SCP-011 finished its march, the Woodstock Volunteers Regiment would re-enter history, and history would consume the town. Langston shouted over the chaos. "We can't fight them. They're not ghosts. They're still trapped in their last battle." Collins' mind raced. If these soldiers had never found peace, they wouldn't stop fighting until... She froze. "You buried us." That was what the voices had said. They had never been laid to rest. Collins turned to SCP-011. "Stand down!" she shouted. The stone figure hesitated. The spectral soldiers wavered. Collins dropped her rifle, stepping forward. "Your war is over." The whispers grew louder, uncertain. She took another step. "You have been forgotten, but I remember you now." SCP-011's grip loosened. The regiment lowered their weapons. A slow, hollow voice echoed from the statue. "Then lay us down, Commander." 30 hours. The last salute. Collins and her team gathered the remains they had found, the skeletal hands still clutching their muskets. They dug graves beneath the frozen earth, one for each fallen soldier. As the final body was placed into the ground, the sky lightened. The air settled, the battlefield faded, replaced by the modern town of Woodstock once more. SCP-011 stood motionless, rifle at its side. Her statue once more. But as Collins turned to leave, she swore she saw something. A single tier of stone. And on the whim, "Thank you." Chapter 4. War in the Present. 60 hours. Woodstock, Vermont. The world felt different. Collins could feel it in the air, the heaviness, the echo of something unfinished. The regiment had faded. The battlefield had vanished. SCP-011 was still once more, but she wasn't convinced it was over. She had seen the tear, a single, impossible crack in the statue's otherwise perfect stone, and that whisper, "Thank you." Collins should have felt relief, but instead her stomach churned. Something wasn't right. 30 hours. A fractured piece. Dr. Langston and Agent Holt were already reviewing data from the night's events. They'd detected temporal shifts, measurable distortions in reality where past and present had begun to blur. Langston shook his head. Containment measures were temporary at best. The soldiers were never supposed to be buried here. They belonged on a battlefield they never left. Then why did SCP-011 accept the burial? Holt asked. Langston exhaled. Because it wasn't a burial, it was an armistice. Collins clenched her jaw. Meaning? Langston's voice was grim. It means they haven't left. Holt paled. You're saying the soldiers are still here? Langston nodded. They're not haunting this place anymore. They're waiting. Collins' blood turned to ice. A war doesn't end until both sides surrender. And the Confederates never did. 15 hours, the second march. The town should have been waking up, but something was wrong. Collins stood in the middle of Main Street, staring at the empty storefronts, the darkened homes. No early risers, no cars, no morning routines. Only silence. Holt ran a scan on his handheld device. Jesus Christ. The town isn't abandoned. The people are still here. Collins snapped to him. What? Langston's face was ashen. He turned his screen toward her. The heat signatures were there. Every house, every building was full of people. But they weren't moving. Not even breathing. Something's holding them, Langston whispered, like they're trapped between moments. Then came the drum. A deep, rhythmic booming sound, faint, distant. Collins turned toward the horizon. A line of shadowed figures stood on the far ridge. Their gray coats tattered, their muskets ready. A Confederate regiment, one that had never surrendered. 1730 hours. A war across time. SCP-011 remained motionless in the town square. But Collins knew it was aware. She stepped toward it. They're here. Nothing. She moved closer, voice tight. You said the war wasn't over. You were right. Silent. You laid your men to rest. But the enemy is still standing. The air around the statue shuddered. The stone creaked. Then, SCP-011 turned its head. Its stone eyes locked onto hers. Everyone, romantic day. Then we march once more. 8 hours. The battle reignites. The sky darkened despite the rising sun. The temperature plunged as frost crawled across the ground. A new battlefield was forming, not in the past, but here, now. And this time, both sides were marching. SCP-011 lifted its rifle. Collins stepped back as the Union ghosts materialized behind him. Hundreds of them, reformed, restored. The Woodstock Volunteers Regiment had returned. Across the field, the Confederates advanced. The war was no longer bound to history. It had broken free, and it was happening now. 15 hours, the unseen enemy. Collins shouted into her radio. Command, we need an immediate evacuation of Woodstock. We are in the middle of an active anomalous war. The Confederates opened fire. Ghostly musket rounds shredded reality as they struck. Windows shattered without being touched. Buildings aged and crumbled like they had been standing for centuries too long. The Union regiment returned fire. Civilians remained trapped in time, unable to move, forced to witness a war they should never have seen. Collins watched in horror as one of her own men, Holt, was struck. His body froze mid-madness, flickered between 2024 and 1862. Then he was gone. His name, his presence, like he had never existed. Langston screamed. They are erasing time itself. 30 hours, the only way out. Collins' mind was racing. The war would never end unless she found a way to break the cycle. SCP-011 was too powerful to destroy. The Confederate regiment had to surrender. But they never had, because they had never been given the chance. Collins grabbed Langston. We need a way to negotiate a surrender. Langston looked at her like she was insane. How do you negotiate with ghosts? Usual ghosts, Collins whispered. Soldiers. She turned to SCP-011. Can you end this? SCP-011 didn't respond. Collins stepped between the lines of fire. "Hold your fire," she shouted. The Union regiment halted. The Confederates hesitated. Collins raised her hands. "I know you were left behind, forgotten, forced to fight a war that should have ended long ago." The Confederate commander stepped forward. His face was a skeletal husk flickering between life and decay. His voice was a distant echo of history. "We did not surrender." Collins took a breath. "Then do it now." The commander's grip on his rifle tightened. SCP-011 watched in silence. Collins steeled herself. "The war is over. Lay down your arms, and I promise, your story won't be forgotten." The Confederates wavered. Then, slowly, the commander lowered his rifle. One by one, his men followed. The battlefield began to dissolve. The soldiers faded into mist. And for the first time in history, the war finally ended. 9:00 hours. The final rest. The air was still. Collins stood in the town square, looking at SCP-011. It had returned to stone, but this time its pose had changed. The rifle was slung over its shoulder, not in battle, but at rest. A single inscription had appeared beneath it. "We remember." Langston stepped beside her. "Is it over?" Collins let out a slow breath. "Yeah." She turned away, eyes heavy with exhaustion. "It's finally over." Chapter 5. The Last Salute. 9:15 hours. Woodstock, Vermont. The morning sun rose over a town changed forever. The streets were silent, the battlefield gone, but something lingered in the air. A presence, a weight of history that had finally been acknowledged. The war was over, but Collins knew that some wars never truly end. She stood before SCP-011, staring at the inscription carved into its stone. "We remember." Langston stood beside her, arms crossed, eyes still scanning for anomalies. "Temporal distortions are stabilizing. No new anomalies. No signs of residual hauntings." Collins exhaled, relief half-formed, never fully allowed. "And the civilians?" Langston nodded. "They're waking up. No memory of what happened. It's like time folded over itself and reset. It was over." Yet Collins still couldn't shake the feeling that something watched from beyond. Not in hostility, not in malice, but in remembrance. 10:00 hours. The Vanishing War. Foundation cleanup crews had arrived. Cover stories were already in place. A gas leak, an isolated electrical surge. The usual lies to explain the unexplainable. Holt was gone. Erased from time. Collins had already given his name for the Foundation's memorial records, but no one outside this mission would ever remember him. "War takes its toll," Langston murmured. Collins clenched her fists. "Even when it shouldn't." The ghostly soldiers had passed on, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that they were still watching, waiting for what she didn't know. 12:00 hours. The Last Salute. Before departing, Collins took one last walk through town. The streets were alive again. People returned to their daily routines, completely unaware that their town had been on the brink of being rewritten by history. Yet something small had changed. In front of the memorial, people now stopped. They read the names engraved on the monument. Some left flowers. A few even saluted. They didn't know why, but they remembered. Collins smiled. Then she turned to SCP-011. The statue stood firm, its pose forever changed. No longer in battle, no longer on guard, but at ease. Collins raised a hand in a slow, deliberate salute. For the briefest moment, so fast she almost doubted it, she swore she saw SCP-011 nod. And then the wind carried a whisper. "Thank you, Commander." Collins lowered her hand, stepping away. The war was finally over, and the past at last could rest.